Hello, Patriotic Christian again. Today I'm going to be addressing the issue of should Christians be patriotic? Now, probably based on the name I've chosen to use, you probably kind of know where I stand on the issue. But I do want to be able to give an explanation, and what I'm trying to do on this channel is to be able to explain and simplify things from a biblical worldview and in a historical perspective. So, should Christians be patriotic? Now I'm going to start by reading the definition of patriotism, because, unless we're on the same page with that, maybe none of this will make sense. All right, so patriotism. Love of one's country, the passion which aims to serve one's country, either in defending it from invasion or protecting its rights and maintaining its laws and institutions in vigor and purity. Patriotism is the characteristic of a good citizen, the noblest passion that animates a man in the character of a citizen. Now, of course, the first part, love of one's country, there's nothing unchristian about that. To, love your fellow citizens, your fellow countrymen, just as you would love anyone else. Certainly nothing wrong with that. And I don't think anyone would disagree. It's some of the other stuff in the definition that people might differ on, because some Christians would, when asked the question, should Christians be patriotic, they might say yes, others might say no, others might say it doesn't matter. So which is it? Now, next I'm going to read another definition. This is the definition of nation, and I think it's important because as we do this little bit of a discussion, I'm going to be doing a little bit more of a Bible study and biblical history kind of study on this. So it will be different from some of my other videos. But the word nation gets used a lot in the Bible. So I'm going to define that as opposed to the word country that was just used in the definition of patriotism. Today they're kind of used synonymously anyway. But I do want to read the definition of nation as well. So a nation is a body of people inhabiting the same country or united under the same sovereign or government, as the English nation or the French nation. It often happens that many nations are subject to one government, in which case the word nation usually denotes a body of people speaking the same language, or a body that has formerly been under a distinct government but has been conquered or incorporated with a larger nation. Thus, the Empire of Russia comprehends many nations, as did formerly the Roman and Persian empires. Nation, as its etymology imports, originally denoted a family or race of men descended from a common progenitor, like tribe, but by immigration and conquest and intermixture of men of different families, this distinction is in most countries lost. And I do believe that the Bible and this dictionary agree on the definition of nation, because originally nation meant a group of people with common ancestry. So where I'm going to go next, I didn't do any illustrations, but I did do this to sort of help you keep track of where I'm at. I'm going to start in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 5. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. So you see the word nations show up. And verse 20, these are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. And then the last two verses of the chapter, 31 and 32, these are the sons of Shem after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Now, I would encourage you to read the whole chapter, and indeed the whole book, and of course the whole Bible, and get the broader context, but for a video I'm not going to go too deep into it. But I did want to point out that this, in Genesis chapter 10, is known as the Table of Nations, and it explains why it was originally defined that a nation was a group of people with common ancestry, because that's how the nations were formed. But this chapter doesn't really explain why. And it explains that it did happen, it records it, but it doesn't really tell you why it happened. And that's where we're going to do a little bit of a Bible study, because it's very important. If nations is something that man devised, then it either doesn't matter, or maybe Christians shouldn't be patriotic. Don't need to be loyal to their nation. But if it's something that God devised, then that changes everything, doesn't it? So where did the idea of nations come from? And to start with, I'm going to have to do a little bit of background. So I'm going to go to Genesis chapter 1. Yeah, that's how far back we're going. The first chapter in the entire Bible. Don't have time to do the whole thing, but here in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 28, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." And the reason I bring this up is it's important to understand that when God created the earth, and he then created man and put man on it, he gave man dominion over the earth. And one of his instructions was to be fruitful and multiply, and to replenish the earth. And that word replenish just means to fill. It doesn't mean to refill, like some people mistakenly believe. Now, we know that this was the original perfect creation that God made. But later, man sinned, bad stuff happened, and things actually got so bad that God actually destroyed the world with a flood. So now we're going to go to Genesis chapter 9, because even after the flood, God repeats some of these same instructions. So I'm going to read Genesis 9, verse 1. "And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth." So again, God is telling Noah, who's kind of starting the human race all over again, he tells them the same thing that he told Adam and Eve. And in case they missed it, he actually, in the same speech, he tells them again. Down in verse 7, "And you be ye fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply therein." I don't know how you can mistake that, right? The idea God is giving is they need to all spread out over all the earth and occupy everything and use everything. And, obviously it wouldn't happen instantly, but that should be their goal. Now, why is any of this important? And the reason is because next we're going to go to Genesis chapter 11. And for those of you familiar with it, it's the story of the Tower of Babel. And I think there's something very interesting in here that could be easily overlooked because you might focus on different aspects of it. But for today's topic, I want to give a special emphasis to, I'll show you. So starting in verse 1, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." Now that's just the end of verse 4, but I'm going to stop for a minute because I think this is really what I need to call attention to. Because they're doing this stuff, and it even tells you why they're doing it. Because they said, "Lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So they're saying, hey, let's build a tower, let's build a city and make a name for ourselves kind of thing, which sort of like, all unite under one banner, so to speak. We'll all go by the same name and not spread out like God told us kind of thing. So Picking up in verse 5, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth." So we had a time in history when everyone spoke the same language. They were all more closely related because, they were all staying together. And God had told them to spread out and populate the whole earth. But they specifically said, let's do this instead because we don't want to do that, what God told us. And God didn't like that. He came down and he came up with a way of getting the job done. Even though they weren't willing to do it, he was able to force it on them by confounding their language. Now they weren't able to cooperate with each other. They had to sort of go their separate ways and do their own thing. And this caused nations to be born, and the nations would then compete with each other for land and resources, and it was kind of a race to see who could settle such areas first, and then other people would try and, take it away from them. And I mean, none of this is necessarily good. Going to war and stealing from each other and stuff. These are not good things. But in the eyes of God, this was better than what they wanted to do previously. So, today when you hear people try to get this idea that, nationhood is a bad thing and, we all need to just dissolve borders and all kind of merge together as one world, you got to understand that the last time man tried to do that, God came in and kind of messed it up because he doesn't want that. He wants us to spread all out over the earth. He doesn't want us all united under one leadership. He wants us all spread out and doing our own things as different nations. And of course, today, nations are not defined by their ancestry so much as they are by their perhaps language, culture, and borders. Sometimes it can be a regional thing, geographical definition for the nation. Sometimes it could be linguistic, and still, many nations today do have a common ancestry for the most part that, keeps them sort of together. But the point is that nations is something that God designed. It wasn't his initial best case scenario plan, but it's something that was necessary because of man's disobedience. And so this only works if people have a sense of loyalty or love of their nation, their culture. It doesn't work if people think, well, there's no difference. And I know that may sound a little bit anti-Christian in some circles because they've adopted this sort of globalist or very non-biblical view of God and of nations. And so it is important to remember that nations exist because God wanted them to. And there's nothing wrong at all with being loyal to your nation. It doesn't mean that you have to hate other nations. It just means that you want to see what's best for your nation. And this doesn't mean that you always support what your government does, because that's usually the argument against patriotism is like, well, how could you love your country? Your government's doing this or that. But throughout history, oftentimes patriots fought against their own government. And they were doing that even though it was because their government wasn't acting in the best interests of their country. And that's a big difference. Being patriotic doesn't mean always supporting your government. But what it does mean is trying to influence your government, trying to do what's best for your country. Not just, going out and soul winning. That's great. We as Christians, we should do those things, but we also need to participate in our government, because all throughout the Old Testament, you have example after example of essentially patriots who did what was best for their country at the time. They weren't perfect, but they did what they could for their country at that time. And we should do the same. You know, we should participate in government. We don't need to make it the center of our lives, certainly, but we should at least vote, and it's not a problem to like your country and to want what's best for it, because honestly, what's best for our country is also what's best for every individual in the country. You know, we want them all to get saved. We want God to be king, and we want to be free. And we should all want these things as Christians. And I don't think we have to eliminate the political front just because there's some stuff we don't like going on in there. We can fight that battle, and we can also fight other battles, personally, politically, spiritually, all of that. So anyway, I hope this explains why I take the position I do, and why it's important to start with a biblical worldview when you try to understand any of this stuff, because otherwise you just end up taking your opinion to the Bible, and you just interpret the Bible to fit whatever, you know, whatever opinion you happen to have formed about it. And this is what many people do today. But when you start with what the Bible teaches, and Genesis is often a great place to start because that's the beginning of a great many things. So reading the book of Genesis is very helpful in understanding a lot of stuff. And nations is one of them, because this is when nations were born, this is when nations began, and we can trace it back to it's something that God set into motion because it accomplishes His plan. So Christians can be patriotic. Doesn't mean you aren't a Christian if you're not patriotic. That's not what it means, but I think it means that, you know, just like Christians should read the Bible, but not every Christian does read the Bible. I mean, that's just the reality. It doesn't mean that, you know, just because some Christians are not patriotic, it doesn't mean that Christians shouldn't be patriotic. I think they should, whatever country you're a part of. I'm from the United States, so I'm an American patriot. If you're from another country, you should be loyal to your country. But you should also remember that doesn't mean being loyal to your government. And in many cases, it means going against your government, because sometimes what's best for your country is not what your government is doing. Anyway, hope this helps. I'll catch you on the next video.